All right, this is Citizenship and Immigration Attorney Parviz Malakouti. Today's September 22nd, 2025, and this is our 36th mobility space. So just as a reminder, today we're talking about Law Professor Zelinsky's paper, really two papers actually, but the most recent one is from 2024. It's a draft called Defending U.S. Citizenship-Based Taxation in Theory and in Practice. And I think that's a fitting title because the theory and the practice don't always line up, meaning that sometimes the consequences of citizenship-based taxation in practice sometimes aren't apparent if you just look at the concept in theory. So I have a feeling we're going to be talking a lot about what citizenship-based taxation means in practice today. So as a reminder, this is our 36th mobility space of 50 mobility spaces that we're doing this year, and the hottest topics in dual citizenship, freedom of movement, sovereignty, and of course, passports. And okay, so the paper we're talking about here. So Professor Zelinsky, he's a law professor. He wrote a paper called Defending U.S. Citizenship-Based Taxation in Theory and in Practice, an essay on fiscal citizenship in a FATCA world, right? Fiscal citizenship as introduced by Professor Zelinsky, and really, actually, I'm not sure if it's introduced by him. I think the concept actually predates the paper, but in effect, it kind of means tax residency. I'm not sure exactly what the finite changes, or excuse me, the finite distinctions are between fiscal citizenship and tax residency. But I understand fiscal citizenship as some sort of financial obligation one has to their country of citizenship, irrespective of where they live in the world. Okay, John, I see that you are at it now. Can you hear us, John?
All right, try again. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, we got you here. Okay, John. So, John, just to lay out a few ideas for how to have this conversation. So, first of all, Professor Zelinsky's not here to defend himself. Uh, John invited him. He's not able to make it, whether because of previous obligation or whatever. But the point is, we're going to try our best not to give short shrift to the ideas presented in this paper. We want to have a real conversation. We want to try to give all positive interpretations possible to Professor Zelinsky's paper, so we can have a real discussion here, right? So we're going to obviously be interpreting Professor Zelinsky's writings based off of the paper that we have and other things that he's written here. The other thing is, we're going to try to have an accessible conversation to everybody, right? Obviously, this is a very complex topic, maybe amongst the most complex topics that there are that exist. But really, what I'd like to do in this conversation, and of course I'll hear from you, John, is I'd like to get to the bottom, really focus on what Professor Zelinsky really thinks are the most important arguments in favor of citizenship-based taxation. That's really the bottom line. What does he think is the justification for the existence of citizenship-based taxation? Why does he think that concerns and criticisms of it are overblown? Pursuant to that, we're obviously going to look at the arguments that Professor Zelinsky makes, as well as the assumptions, right? What are the starting assumptions? What are his starting premises, right? Do we agree with his starting premises? Do we disagree with the premises that he starts with, right? Or is it that we actually all start at the same point, but we have a difficulty with his reasoning, with basically where he goes with those premises? So, would you agree, John? We're trying to have a conversation here that, first of all, as many people as possible can understand, and then secondly, we don't want to set up a straw man. We want to basically present the strongest argument that Professor Zelinsky might have in defending citizenship-based taxation. Would you agree there, John?
Okay, yeah, no, of course I would agree with that.
Okay, wonderful. So, John, you sent me over kind of an outline of some things to discuss in this article. I think before we kind of get into the weeds, the first thing we should start with is, what's the main point of Professor Zelinsky's article? So that's my general question to you. By the way, as a reminder to everybody else, anybody else who wants to discuss is welcome to. You don't have to wait to be invited. Just send me a request. I'll approve it right away, and you can contribute on any point or on the main point if you like. But John, what do you take to be the main point? What's the gist of Professor Zelinsky's argument in his 2024 paper?
Well, first of all, you say in his 2024 paper, this is actually at least the second paper that he's written. The first one was in 2011. At that point, his argument was that citizenship taxation was justifiable because citizenship was like domicile, and domicile was a legitimate basis for tax residency. Now, that was 2011. Interestingly, in this 2024 paper, although I believe he probably assumes that 2011 argument, I think the bottom line is simply this, that basically citizenship carries obligations. Taxation is an important obligation of citizenship. Therefore, all citizens should pay U.S. taxes. I think it's really as simple as that. I mean, he meanders here, there, and everywhere over 155 pages. He tries to soften the blow of the message by trying to make the point that somehow citizenship taxation is not dissimilar from certain residency-based taxation regimes that, as a matter of fact, define people as residents when they don't live in their country. But really, that's about it, I think. Do you see it differently?
I see it as you mentioned. I would agree there. Um, the 2011 paper by Professor Zelinsky was based on the argument that, as I understood it, um, citizenship and domicile both have similar concepts of allegiance to a country. Number two, that it's a less fact intensive inquiry to determine a person's citizenship than it is to determine a person's domicile. Therefore, number three, uh, taxation based off of citizenship would entail some sort of efficiency gains. Okay, it would be less fact intensive, less difficult. Okay, for the United States and for other countries to tax on that basis. That was kind of how I understood the 1, 2, 3 of his 2011 paper. As I wrote before, I had a few kind of problems with that. One is that I don't think the relevant inquiry or the relevant question is it easy to know for sure one country of which a person is citizen? I think that's relatively easy. I think most people, and of course we have some stateless people, but most people on earth, okay, can point to at least one country that they know with a reasonable degree of certainty that they're a citizen of. Okay, I think if that was the threshold question, then I would possibly agree that there are gains in focusing on at least gains in terms of a less fact-intensive inquiry to focus on where a person is citizen versus where a person has been domiciled. But in a multinational world, we have 190 countries. We have people who travel between countries, live between countries. The relevant inquiry is not, do you know for sure one country that you are a citizen of? The relevant inquiry for a person who wants to be in compliance is, do you know with certainty all the countries that you are citizen of, right? And that's where I think his argument falls apart as early as that point. Okay, and there's other problems downstream as well. But for people who are outside of the citizenship and immigration world, I think there's, even among lawyers, I think there's kind of a presumption, and maybe I'm taking an extra step further, and I'm maybe assuming that this is an assumption that Professor Zelinsky is making. But I think a lot of people assume that uh, if you've not had contact with a country, if you don't have a passport from the country, if you don't have any documents from that country, well, then obviously you're not a citizen of that country. And as we've discussed ad nauseum in plenty of spaces before, and other people have, that's simply not the case. Citizenship by acquisition of birth occurs by operation of law. There are tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people worldwide that were born citizens of another country, okay, that are totally unaware of that. Okay, they don't know that that's the case. In a world of taxation and competing taxation systems, for a person to be reliably in compliance, and to be fair, we're talking more his paper. He's a U.S. tax professor, so his papers focuses more on U.S. tax system and U.S. tax residents, especially U.S. persons, U.S. citizens, are have I estimate, I believe, several tens of millions of U.S. citizens who were born by operation of law, citizens of other countries. In a world in which to be in compliance, your taxation obligations are tied to your citizenship, right? I don't think that person gets any gains. I don't think the tax system or the nations get any gains in administratability, okay, by shifting from a domicile inquiry to a citizenship-based inquiry. So that was my very first problem with his 2011 paper, which is, to me, it presumed that he thought it's not hard. It's not that difficult, actually, for a person to foreclose the possibility of being citizen in other countries, right? Now, I wrote to you, John, before this space, a couple questions I had. I'm a citizenship and immigration lawyer. I have, a curiosity, and I'd like to learn, obviously, about tax issues, but I'm not a tax professor or tax lawyer or a tax expert. That's, of course, your area, John. I wrote to you just a few thoughts that I had about Professor Zelinsky's paper, Disordered Thoughts, right? Um, the first was that, so Professor Zelinsky, for those who haven't read the paper, he actually references Laura Snyder and John Richardson in the paper, right? So he's, he references them as kind of part of the group of people that are critical of U.S. Citizenship-based taxation. And particularly around page 106, Professor Zelinsky focuses on Laura Snyder's comments. And the way I read it, John, and I'd like to hear what you think, it seems to me that Professor Zelinsky takes Laura Snyder's comments, basically objecting to an obligation to nation expressed through what I call, my words, tax fealty, okay, expressed through some sort of paying of taxation, or if not paying of taxation, at least the act, okay, the obedient act of filing a taxation, an income tax return yearly, even if you don't owe anything, okay, it's kind of as like a yearly, act of kind of, compliance and obligation and fealty. To me, it seems like Professor Zelinsky kind of confuses, he kind of conflates objections Laura Snyder might have, okay, about an obligation through tax fealty that a person has, with the idea that a citizen of a country that lives outside of the country would not have any obligations to that home country. I thought that Professor Zelinsky's comments on pages 106 to 108 were kind of setting up a straw man in that regard. My question to you, John, is, do you take Professor Zelinsky's criticisms, or let's say opposition to Laura Snyder's comments, as him thinking that, or him stating that Laura Snyder says that a person who's a citizen of a country living outside of the country should have no obligations to the country, or specifically that Laura's just saying that it shouldn't be through a tax obligation or even a reporting obligation? How do you take Professor Zelinsky's comments there, pushing back against Laura, and to a lesser extent yourself?
Okay. First of all, I just want to add one thing that came to mind as I was listening to your introduction. Okay, and I think that this is extremely important. That for most of humanity, citizenship is conferred by birth. It's conferred by birth. Okay. Yes, there's naturalization. There's this and there's that. But for most of humanity, citizenship is conferred by birth, right? So therefore, very clearly, to define tax residency in terms of citizenship is tax residency based on the circumstances of nothing but birth, and not, okay, or secondarily on the circumstances of life. The rest of the world, by using residence-based taxation, Eritrea accepted, and we'll come back to Eritrea, is of the view that tax residency, meaning should you be subject to the full force of the tax code, all right, is based on circumstances of the person's life. Where do they live? What is their financial? What is their residential connection to a country? In Professor Zelinsky's world, that is completely irrelevant. It's simply birth, nothing more. So from his perspective, all right, somebody born to two U.S. citizens abroad, acquiring U.S. citizenship by birth who never, set foot in the United States is somehow appropriately defined as a tax resident of the United States. And that is, I think, an astounding proposition. In these kinds of circumstances, citizenship, he talks about citizenship having, loyalty or something. I mean, that is, well, I mean, to keep this as neutral as possible, a highly questionable concept, right? That somebody with no connection to the United States that simply meets the statutory requirements has somehow loyalty to the United States or should be sort of scooped up in the U.S. tax net. Another point on that, he talks about, later he talks about, as a citizen, you're part of the polity of the United States, this sort of stuff. I think it's worth pointing out that American citizens do not have a constitutional right to vote in the United States. We're talking about federal taxation. Voting is determined only under state law, state constitution, that's it. And there are at least 13 states that deny American citizens abroad the right to vote anyway, right? But now, having said that, to answer your question, which is simply, is he saying that Laura Snyder, for example, or anybody else would say that citizenship carries no obligations? No, Laura Snyder is not saying that at all. All right. The point is that Professor Zelinsky is defining the obligation of citizenship almost solely or predominantly in terms of taxation. Because the only way that you can actually make a credible argument to the effect that you shouldn't be subject to citizenship tax, or that the claim that you shouldn't be subject to citizenship tax is because you don't have obligations to the country, is if you define the obligations of citizenship as taxation. And that is, in fact, what Professor Zelinsky is doing.
Yeah, John, that's exactly what I was getting at, right? If you conflate the idea of any sort of obligation of a citizen living outside of the country to the country of citizenship with a tax obligation, it would have to mean necessarily that you're defining the obligation that people have towards their country of citizenship solely in tax terms. That's exactly the thought that
Right,
came to
and,
my
and
mind.
I would add, I would add to that is exactly the problem. That is exactly the problem that the view in his paper, which is I think accepted by a number of other tax academics, is that citizenship equals taxation.
Well, just
That's what it is.
just to highlight that for a second, if we're going to try and discuss the paper from the standpoint of assuming good faith, if we assume that he is asking the question of Laura, essentially the position of, if you are a citizen, what do you owe, which I think is what maybe is even higher level than do you owe taxes. It's interesting because, especially from the United States standpoint, which is viewed as, the beacon of capitalism, blah blah whatever, it actually is at the highest level a viewpoint of one of collectivism versus individualism. Where if we look at it from the standpoint of the individual, and obviously, John, I agree with your viewpoint, so in no way am I trying to argue with you. But we are viewing it from the standpoint of the individual, and that's why we feel these sorts of requirements, whether it's taxation, compliance, anything, as a true infringement and a wrong. And obviously, just to be clear, I agree with that sentiment. But that's from the individualistic standpoint, where from the collectivist, almost you could argue communist standpoint, like if the whole is more important than the individual, then I think the other side of the argument viewed through that paradigm makes a lot more sense.
Couple things inverted. First of all, that's an apt observation. And in fact, I don't know if you read the paper, but Professor Zelinsky characterizes his opposition as based off of a hyper libertarian viewpoint. Okay. You touched on that perfectly, right? So what you call individual based off of an individual, istic type of standpoint, he calls hyper libertarian, right? But here's the thing, inverted. the thesis that he puts forth, right? It's not necessarily, though, at least the way I read it, it's not necessarily, oh, what's going to collect the most tax for the United States. His argument, based going back to 2011, is that it's more administratable, okay, to tax based off of citizenship, meaning basically that there's efficiency gains, okay, and not having to go through fact intensive inquiries, right? If the argument was just, hey, we're the United States, we're the most important, biggest country in the world. No other country, we're going to claim taxes of all of our citizens, regardless of where they are. And because we have the biggest military, there's nothing else other country can do about it, right? That would be, I think that would be a harder argument to argue against from a non-moralistic standpoint, right? Because to an extent, the United States does impose its policies on all countries and all people around the world, right? But that's not really what his the way I read it. That's not really what Professor Zelinsky's claim is. It's that citizenship is a proxy, can be a proxy for domicile, because it's just easier to know where all the countries, or what country a person is a citizen of. All right, so it's just easier administration. You get what I'm saying, inverted?
Yeah, I understand. And that makes sense. I think in the world we currently live in, where it's only United States imposing this system, I'm not completely unsympathetic to that view, because so much of the responsibility and potential penalty lies on the citizen. Um, and we'd also have to consider the alternative, right? Like, I do think it is. I am of the view that if we said, okay, let's introduce residency-based taxation, which obviously I am for that. I do think that in the sense of policing the people that we already know they would want to police to ensure non-abuse, it would be more administratively complex than the current system is, because they don't have to worry about that at all. Yeah.
Well, if you take, I mean,
So I think,
if you take the
look,
perspective of the United States operating by its own set of rules and no other country can operate in the same system, yeah, maybe, right? But ostensibly there should be some sort, not even necessarily full harmonization, but there should be some harmonization. I mean, all it takes is one or two other big countries trying to do the same, and then obviously you're in a mess. Whatever gains you might have gotten by avoiding an inquiry based off of domicile are given right back by countries playing tug of war over a taxpayer. Go ahead, John.
look, the question, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Now I can.
Yeah. Good. Okay. The question is not whether citizenship taxation is justified at this juncture in the conversation. I think the question, what we're really addressing, is whether citizenship carries obligations. And yes, I do think that citizenship, at least potentially, should carry obligations. Okay. That's for sure. But that's not the question. The question is whether, okay, taxation based on income not associated with the United States at the time when you don't live in the United States should be one of those obligations. That's the question here. And I agree with you. I mean, I find his analysis of Laura stuff is rather rather dismissive and not very well considered. I've never understood Laura Snyder, or anybody else for that matter, to be saying that citizens shouldn't carry obligations. The issue is not even whether taxation should be one of them. It's far more precise than that. The issue is whether citizens who do not live in the United States and have no income associated with the United States should be subject to taxes, penalties, and reporting with respect to that specific income. That's the issue here. It's not abstract. It's very specific. And one of the things that Professor Zelinsky does constantly, I mean, you could characterize his papers 155 pages of abstract theory.
I would even take it a step further and say not even just penalties, but penalties that are more severe than the same infringement were it to occurred domestically, which is impossible to defend.
Well, that's right. That's right. And to that should be added, let's be clear here. The United States imposes a more punitive tax system on U.S. citizens living outside the United States with respect to their income not associated with the United States precisely because it's foreign. Now, he might say, well, all American citizens are subject to those rules, but that's like saying the law on its majestic equality prohibits both the rich and the poor from living on the park bench. The point is that Americans abroad who are tax residents of other countries are basically penalized and subject to a much more punitive tax system with respect to participation in the tax systems, the retirement planning systems, the pension systems, etc., of those other countries. And so, look, I like Professor Zelinsky on a personal level. I think he's a very bright man. And, I think he's done a good job of taking a bunch of abstract concepts, putting them together. But the problem is that I don't think he has the first understanding of what this actually is about.
Yeah, I mean, that's, to me, that's actually the most difficult to reconcile part. Obviously, I don't agree with citizenship-based taxation, but it is what it is born into the system. Okay, sure. But the fact that we deal with more abuse being outside than inside, I would be very curious to hear someone that is a proponent of citizenship-based taxation attempt to defend that particular aspect. Okay, they're going to say, okay, we got to get the bad guys, the rich billionaires, fine. Okay, but the reality is that it's really hitting normal people, and that point alone deserves some recognition.
Absolutely. And it hits only normal people because normal people have to survive. They have to make a living. They have to feed their kids. They have to pay their bills where they live. Look, another way of viewing this, right? And I think that every single paper I've seen from a tax academic, I think suffers from this, right? Or, well, I'm not going to use pejorative language like that. I will take that back. Is characterized by the following, okay? When you look and when you think about citizenship taxation, if you're a tax academic in the United States or in the United States, I think that, you sort of default into seeing this as, well, how do we tax the people who decide they want to move out of the United States and live outside the United States? Should they be able to get away, somehow by moving away? But that is looking at it, from a very sort of US centric way. See, all US source income is taxable regardless. So the only practical meaning of US citizenship taxation is the United States imposing the full force of its tax code on people who do not live in the United States, are tax residents of other countries, with respect specifically to the income not associated with the United States. That's what citizenship taxation is in actuality.
You're saying that's the argument of the academic point of view, or the federal, like if
Now, the academics see it only as though, you have some U.S. citizen, who happens to have moved outside the United States. And they don't understand how the tax system works at all. The extent of their knowledge is sort of like, there's foreign tax credit rules and there's foreign earned income exclusion. And many of these papers, actually have the temerity to suggest that foreign tax credit rules and that, or possibly treaties, are a defense against double taxation. I mean, this is so insanely, irresponsibly, and offensively incorrect because obviously none of these people have never heard of or they're willfully blind with respect to things like the 2017 transition tax that confiscated the pensions of many Americans abroad, the 2017 GILTI rules that made it impossible for Americans abroad to use the kinds of business structures that their friends and neighbors in other countries would, or the PFIC rules that are guaranteed. They are absolutely guaranteed double taxation And all a PFIC is, if you really understood it, you explain it this way. Well, what a PFIC is the way it's taxed by the United States is if you don't pay tax on this before you've received actual income from it, then we're going to tax you really punitively at the time that you do receive the income from it. These people have no understanding of this stuff at all. In fact, there is not a single reference to this kind of punitive taxation in that paper. Not one. So in other words, all of these academic papers are in a sense sort of a theoretical fantasy of what they imagine the US citizenship taxation regime to be, completely devoid of any understanding of what it actually is.
How would, if you were going to be, maybe even allow yourself to be a little bit cynical, when you say how it really is, to put that as succinctly as you can, and to also probably concede what its actual intent is from the side of the government, how would you put that then? What is it? What are they misunderstanding?
They misunderstand how it actually works. They misunderstand that first of all, let's back up here for a minute and let's talk theoretically the way tax academics do. So basically, US citizens are, the moment they move outside the United States, they are dual tax residents if they become a tax resident of another country. Tax residency means that you're subject to the full set of tax rules in any country that you live in. Therefore, a US citizen who moves outside another country, whether it's the Bahamas or whether it's Canada, all right, is a dual tax resident and is subject to the full force of US taxation and their country of residence. That in and of itself means double taxation. Now, let's look at the situation of, say, the Bahamas. They don't have income taxes, but they have plenty of other taxes, if you live there, et cetera, right? So you're paying US and Bahamas taxation. In fact, that is double taxation, because if the US did not have citizenship taxation, you'd pay taxation only in the Bahamas. Now let's move up to Canada, which I do agree is, a reasonably robust tax treaty. I mean, understand that foreign tax credit rules are a recognition of double taxation and simply a mitigation of it in practicality. Doesn't mean there's no double taxation. Absolutely there is. So when you have somebody saying, okay, that, well, somehow taxation is, an obligation of citizenship. In the case of U.S. citizens, what they're actually saying is that, well, if you move outside the United States, then double taxation is an obligation of U.S. citizenship. And that doesn't even get to the problems of, the use of this to essentially siphon capital out of other countries. Let's look at a simple example like, in many countries, the sale of a principal residence is a tax-free capital gain. Well, that's a policy decision made by a country's government in relation to their tax system, which is designed to facilitate a certain societal result that they want. Usually that people are able to move, in a laterally or upwardly mobile kind of way. So the United States comes in and says, well, you know what we're going to do is we're just going to extract that gain out of your country, essentially disabling a U.S. citizen from having the same benefits that other residents of that country might have. And this carries over into other things.
And the U.S. citizen would have if they were in the U.S. Don't forget. Meaning we would get that exemption if you're in the U.S., but you don't get it if you're outside, which is absurd.
You would get it in the U.S.?
Usually a primary residence, you get some sort of capital gains exemption, assuming you go buy a new house, right?
Well, you get a 250,000 exclusion on the gain, a 250,000 exclusion on the gain
per head, right? I believe. Meaning for
per tax.
for a married couple.
would get
Right.
500,000.
Yeah.
A married couple would get 500,000. But look, I mean, let's be clear. To make the claim that taxation is is part of what citizenship is, which is actually what I believe Professor Zelinsky is claiming. All right, then he's necessarily also claiming that double taxation is, if an American citizen should have the freedom to move to another country.
John, do you think some of this, I mean, how much of the delta in understanding or perception of the issue comes from a lack of focus on the compliance costs versus the actual tax bill that results at the end? And Professor Zelinsky. So I'm looking at page 12. By the way, his article is linked to this space if anybody wants to open up and follow along. But on page 12, Professor Zelinsky focuses, actually, he doesn't really focus. He kind of just gives a quick dismissal of compliance cost concerns. On page 12, he says, this causes the critics to shift their concern to the compliance costs U.S. tax law imposes on overseas citizens. In this context, the critics' bête noire is FATCA. Indeed, the tone and substance of current criticism has been stimulated by FATCA and FATCA's perceived interference with the routine financial transactions of overseas U.S. citizens. While some features of FATCA should be liberalized, FATCA's disclosure regime at its core is a reasonable means of combating tax avoidance through offshore accounts. And then the last sentence he says is FATCA is thus a proper method of implementing the obligations of U.S. fiscal citizenship for all U.S. citizens, including those citizens who live abroad. So that's kind of that's not a very thorough treatment of the concerns of FATCA compliance. How much? I mean, do you think Professor Zelinsky would still have his stance if he actually was dealing with people that were living abroad and having to comply with FATCA and whatever, being denied bank accounts or whatever else it is, or do you think he'd have a totally different viewpoint?
Look, first of all, let's analyze the excerpt that you just read me. He starts off with compliance and then starts talking about FATCA. His discussion of the compliance cost is frankly most notable in its absence, which he doesn't talk about at all. Let's start talking about compliance costs a little bit, okay? So, we have some poor schmuck American, who decides that they want to run their business through something that under the Treasury regulations is a small business corporation. Well, then all of a sudden they're into this Form 5471 type of thing. I mean, it's easy to spend $5,000, to complete that form and all of these other things. He may or may not have a concept of what these compliance costs actually are, but if he does, he's certainly not discussing them in this paper at all. And in fact, many people are renouncing citizenship precisely because of the compliance costs that they cannot meet every year. And some of these are people of very, very modest means because, look, I mean, if you're in the compliance is a problem because of the U.S. tax system for everybody. But once again, it's particularly onerous for Americans abroad because basically the one thing that the United States tax system hates more than anything else is anything that's foreign, whether it's entities, income streams, et cetera, et cetera. There's massively expensive reporting. People can't afford this. So I cannot understand how a paragraph that begins talking about compliance then decides to not talk about compliance and moves into FATCA, which has nothing to do with compliance whatsoever, other than Form 8938, which is the one form that he talks about. It's also the easiest form to complete. FATCA is basically a bank account access problem for Americans abroad. It is not a compliance problem.
John, when we say the word compliance, if Professor Zelinsky was here today and we said, Professor Zelinsky, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of compliance in the sense of a potential issue? I'm of the opinion, and I'm curious your thoughts, I'm of the opinion that he would probably respond with something along the lines of, well, making sure that the people that are supposed to pay taxes, which we already know who he's referring to, are doing so, and that they are not able to work around it. He's not going to say very easily, but that's what he really means. I think that when we say compliance, that's what it means to this group of people, even though that's very different than we think of.
I don't think there's any basis for that. I think they don't know what they mean. I don't think that these people have any sense. I don't believe that any one of these people could complete a tax return for an American abroad if their life depended on it. I don't think they understand how the U.S. tax rules sort of filter down, to everyday types of things that people use in life. I mean, what could compliance mean? I mean, that's a general view of compliance. Well, we want to make sure that people meet their obligations under the Internal Revenue Code. But the reality is, okay, for a U.S. citizen inside the United States, that probably means walking into H&R Block, giving a W-2 or something and producing a return. For an American abroad, it means something entirely different. And that is a hugely costly thing. And, I'm going to be honest, it is outright offensive to mention compliance, okay, because that's what it really is for Americans abroad. And then somehow, conflated to having to do with FATCA. I mean, to me, that represents, it's indicative of a huge blind spot and lack of understanding of what this is really about. But that's the problem. They don't understand what this is really about.
John, another consistent theme throughout the paper that I noticed that I'd like to get your thoughts on. And you know what? I'll start off by reading an excerpt and then I'll explain what I mean. So, actually, on the very next page, page 13, he writes, in short, when compared with the rules by which other nations in practice tax their residents living abroad on their worldwide income, the United States implements the worldwide income taxation of its overseas citizens in a matter which is neither as idiosyncratic nor as harsh as the critics maintain. I just want to read that one more time. He references, the comparison he makes is other nations taxing their residents living abroad. Okay, so he's comparing basically what other countries do to their citizens that are still tax resident. Okay, in the country, they're still in the tax net, living abroad. He compares that with the situation of U.S. citizens, which, of course, even if you're not resident, even if you never stepped foot in the United States for years and years, you're still a U.S. citizen taxed abroad. Does that strike you as an apples to oranges comparison, John?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In my view, Professor Zelinsky is completely wrong in how he characterizes at least the Canadian tax situation. I mean, first of all, in no situation that he references in his paper is there treating somebody as a resident of Canada or Australia or anywhere else without some kind of connection that's an indicator of having a life in that country. Okay? Now, it may not always be actual physical presence, right? Or it may. But in no case is Canada, Australia, or the UK reaching out and saying, well, we're just going to claim somebody who's never had anything to do with the country whatsoever, and we're going to treat them as a tax resident. Okay, that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is this, that those cases that he cites, well, actually, here, before I forget this point, those are absolutely minority cases. All right. To suggest that because of one or two cases he's found in Canada, the test in Canada is called ordinary residence, by the way. That's what they call it, ordinarily resident. Okay. Because he's found, a few cases of people who are deemed to be ordinarily resident in Canada who've actually been living outside of Canada. I mean, those are so few and far between that to extrapolate a general principle from that is ridiculous. In fact, most people who want to leave Canada just leave Canada. Now, they're supposed to be subject to a departure tax. We'll get to that in a minute. But I would also add, and this is absolutely critical, that even if those people maintain some kind of stuff existing in Canada, all right, in most cases, and I think the overwhelming majority of cases, when they leave Canada, they can use a tax treaty to sever residency with Canada. And my point, or a point that needs to be made that is absolutely critical here, is that U.S. citizens under U.S. tax treaties, specifically because of the savings clause, are denied the opportunity to use a tax treaty to sever residency with the United States. So, I mean, apples and oranges, that's a kind way of putting it.
To your point, John, I mean, those two systems are the system in the United States and basically everywhere else, for conversation's sake, are so fundamentally different that to suggest that they're not anything but that argues that a person that would make that argument is fundamentally misunderstanding the situation. Like, that's almost the end of the conversation, it would seem.
Well, do you think he's misunderstanding the situation?
To make that statement strongly suggests that we have to go back to square one and define things, because we're talking about, very different animals.
Look, let's ask the question more simply. Do you think that there's any similarity whatsoever between Canada treating somebody as a tax resident? No, let's be more precise. Canada not allowing somebody to sever tax residency with Canada because they still have a connection to Canada in some way or another. Do you think there's any similarity between that whatsoever in U.S. citizenship taxation?
No, and they couldn't be more different, period.
Okay, so why does he make the claim that somehow, well, they're not as different as you might think? What's his basis for that?
I mean, you've heard me for the past 25 minutes attempt to argue his position, or at least give him the benefit of the doubt. I struggle here. I'm total open-minded. Maybe Brent or someone could think of something, patience, but I don't know how you can come to that conclusion unless you just don't understand the two systems at a very nuanced level.
Well, yeah, okay. I think that's probably right. I think that's probably right. I mean, there's a reason this is called citizenship taxation, which is based mainly on circumstances of birth and not circumstances of life. The point is that in the examples he's giving, Australia, Canada are not allowing somebody to sever tax residency who was a tax resident of Canada based on circumstances of their life, not on circumstances of their birth.
Yeah, I mean, put a different way, a person, an Australian or a Canadian, can shed themselves of residency without losing their citizenship, whereas an American cannot. So, I mean, that's the difference, right? And it's funny, John. I wrote in an email to you before. To me, Professor Zelinsky tries to spin that fact into a positive, actually, right? And I wrote that in the third part of the email that I sent to you. Professor Zelinsky says, okay, so on page 42, he writes, however, the U.S. exit tax of Code Section 877A only applies upon an individual's formal renunciation of her U.S. citizenship. Thus, in comparison with the Australian and Canadian exit taxes, the comparable U.S. levy is harder to trigger since the U.S. departure tax only operates if a U.S. citizen affirmatively renounces her U.S. citizenship. Mere non-residence does not activate the U.S. exit tax for U.S. citizens. So to me, the way I read that, and I even had to check with you, John, I was like, is that really, is it true that Canadians or Australians fall into being a non-resident and involuntarily trigger an exit tax on themselves? Because to me, that excerpt reads as it does. It sounds to me like Professor Zelinsky is trying to imply that, there's more safeguards against, a U.S. citizen being subject to an exit tax. But that's only because the person has to give up the whole thing. They got to give up the whole kit and caboodle, the U.S. citizenship, in order to trigger the exit tax.
Look, I am not aware of any Canadians who, religiously file tax returns as resident of Canada and spend a bunch of time out of Canada. I'm not aware of the Canada Revenue Agency said, hey, look, buddy, we think you don't live in Canada and we want to hit you up with Canada's departure tax. I mean, that's another example of confusing theory with reality. I mean, I suppose that theoretically that's a possibility, right? But the reality is that that it really is not. But on the subject of exit taxes, again, this is an area where I think he just doesn't understand Canada's departure tax. To look, the 877A exit tax, the U.S. one covers everything, including pensions, all kinds of things. Canada's departure tax, although there's no exemption, okay, doesn't apply to Canadian real estate. It doesn't apply to pension plans. It doesn't apply to tax deferred accounts. It basically is, applying to, property, shares, etc. It's a far more limited kind of thing. And the other thing about it is, okay, and I think that this is absolutely critical, is that the Canada's departure tax applies at the point that you move from Canada. Therefore, it's taxing gains that actually accrued while you were living in Canada. The problem with the U.S. exit tax, as it applies to Americans abroad, is that it's a deemed disposition of everything, including foreign, non-U.S. pensions and that sort of stuff. And for many of these people, the people renouncing, those are assets that accrued at the time they were not living in the United States. So this is one more example of the use of citizenship taxation to impose the U.S. tax code on assets and income streams that have absolutely nothing to do with the United States. And to add the level of punitiveness on this, right? So pensions are within the ambit of 877A, but I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but let me be very, very clear. If it's a foreign pension, meaning a non-US pension, they will force distribution of the whole thing right then and there. So let's imagine you have a pension with a commuted value of $1 million. It's a non-US pension. You want to renounce the day before. They're going to treat that as you have to include the $1 million on your last US tax return. Are you ready for this? If it's a US based pension, that's not required. That is not required. I mean, you can't make this kind of unfairness up.
To attempt to argue, obviously I agree with you, John, to attempt to argue Professor Zelinsky's potential position, he's essentially trying to get at the fact that perhaps the United States is the only place where you can be a citizen and yet be a resident of nowhere. Most, at least first world places, would insist that you be a resident of somewhere. And if his argument is, oh, look, citizenship is a nice proxy for domicile because it's so simple, then maybe that's what he's attempting to get at, because, oh, look, it's so simple. This is just how it works. You don't have to worry about these extra complications, which we would argue is life. But from an overly simplistic view, perhaps.
Well, okay, overly simplistic view maybe, but why don't we characterize it as a view that doesn't understand the reality of living outside the United States? I mean, that's why it's overly simplistic.
Living outside of the United States, at least on a semi-permanent basis, meaning like trying to fully live life. This is not retirees, which I'm sure we would concede is a huge amount of Americans that quote unquote leave the US. Okay, but like you really kept the financial center of your life in the United States. These are people that are truly, meaning the people we are arguing are actually having issues, are the people that A, are not super rich and truly and fully have their lives outside of the US.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. And, this constant harping on, well, this affects only the wealthy. And you'll see that, throughout the 155 pages here, there, and everywhere. Actually, it's the opposite. Okay. This affects the middle class because they're the people who have to actually go out every day and make a living, who have to do retirement planning, who have to have pension plans, stuff like that. The super rich generally are not in that category. In fact, many of them, may very well have a lot of their assets in the United States and rely on U.S. income streams.
Certainly agree.
Is it a fair characterization, John, that at least half, if not the bulk, of the double taxation, quote unquote, is in the cost to comply versus the actual tax bill, and that's where the difference in opinion is. That's where Professor Zelinsky gives short shrift.
No, I don't think so. I think it's completely dependent. I mean, let's go back to 2017, the transition tax, right? Essentially, for people who don't understand what that is, you had people who see different countries have different. Well, here's a shocker. A shocker. Different countries have different tax systems. Tax systems are, usually designed to fulfill some kind of public policy objective in the country. Now, what that also means is that different tax systems have different, what I would call, cultures of corporations. Now, some countries, people are encouraged to use corporations, for financial planning and that sort of thing. And in some countries, I would include Canada in that, I think, small business corporations are effectively designed to be used as private pension plans for self-employed people who don't have, normal kinds of pension plans. Now, we have the Treasury regulations in 1996. This is another reason why citizenship taxation has to go, right? Is simply designated all the Canadian corporations as per se corporations, which locked them into, the transition tax and GILTI. But let's say, you've got your pension, you have $1 million pension, which is not unusual, if you're an employee or whatever. So 2017 comes along and says, we're gonna basically put a one-time U.S. tax on your pension, even though you've never received it. And for many people, this was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah, the compliance costs on that were really high, but that was a real tax cost. Make no mistake about it. There are real tax costs to citizenship taxation. Compliance, it's a terrible thing. I mean, the problem is this, right? What's a lot of money? Well, it depends on how much money you have. For simple people with simple jobs, $500 a year, $800 a year, which is where a U.S. tax return would start for Americans abroad, is a hell of a lot of money.
I think maybe
Okay.
I'm misunderstanding Parviz, John, but I think he was saying relative to what the actual tax liability would be for these normal middle class people.
Sometimes the compliance cost dwarfs the tax owing. Yeah.
What I mean, basically,
I mean, there are lots of people who do not owe U.S. tax. There's also lots. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I see what happened. Look, some people owe actual tax, some don't. Certainly, the compliance costs are always there, though, and they're always high. Okay.
yeah,
They are high for the person paying the cost. Simple people usually have simple incomes. $800, $500 is a lot of money for them. People with a lot of stuff going on, high incomes, high cash flow, they pay proportionally. The compliance costs are very high and they are an issue. And, well,
Especially in Brent's usual argument for small business owners, meaning like people that really this is just a very basic thing, but has the same sort of compliance requirements as a full-blown multinational. That's, an objective, at least I guess it's not subjective, but I would argue objective absurdity of the whole quote unquote compliance regime.
yes, of course it is. Of course it is.
John, in the parts of Professor Zelinsky's 2024 paper in which he talks about treaties, exemptions, and exceptions that result in no net tax bill for a U.S. citizen living abroad, he doesn't mention the cost to prepare the income tax return and to file it, right? As inverted we're saying, right, and as you said just now, right, um, that cost is there regardless of whether there's ultimately a tax bill for the person or not. It's, as you always say, it's not how much they take from you, it's what they leave you with, right? And the
Yeah.
compliance bill, right, I would argue falls within that category. If you argue,
It's a special tax on Americans abroad. It's a
right,
special tax on them.
right, exactly.
Well, and
Um,
then adds serious penalties for even non-willful non-compliance. Like that's
Yeah,
material.
we haven't even mentioned the emotional toll or the stress, and the high stakes. We're talking about just so far, even just the dollars and cents of, of hiring a preparer to prepare those. I ask myself, I read Professor Zelinsky's papers. Okay, what's the argument in favor? Why is he saying that CBT should exist? Is he just arguing in a vacuum? Did he just find people picking on CBT and think, no, those are bad arguments, I'm going to argue against it? And to me, I think, and I have his 2011 paper up here, the crux of his argument is that it's more efficient. It's more efficient to tax people based off of the citizenship rather than domicile. So I'll just read. It's not that long. I'll read the first part of the abstract from his 2011 paper. Okay, that paper is titled "Citizenship and Worldwide Taxation: Citizenship as an administrable proxy for domicile." The United States worldwide taxation of a citizen is less different from international residency-based norms than is widely believed and is sensible as a matter of tax policy. An individual citizenship is an administrable, if sometimes overly broad, proxy for his domicile. His permanent home, excuse me. Both citizenship and domicile measure an individual's permanent allegiance rather than his immediate physical presence. Because citizenship and domicile resemble each other, and because other nations often define residence for tax purposes as domicile, the US system of citizenship-based taxation typically reaches the same results as the residence-based system of these other nations, and here I think is the most important part, but reaches these results more efficiently by avoiding factually complex inquiries about domicile. So in super basic terms, the way I read this is, okay, he's saying citizenship is like residency. Many countries treat residency like domicile, okay? But we can tax people more efficiently on citizenship than domicile. Therefore, taxation citizenship as an administrable proxy for domicile.
Even the way you worded that in his last sentence, you say we. Because my question to him would be, from whose viewpoint is it more efficient? But that we, he has to be arguing from the government standpoint.
Oh, for
right?
sure. That's the way I read it. Absolutely. That's the way I read it. Exactly.
Parvez, what he's saying is this: that it's a hell of a lot easier to tax people based on who they are rather than what they do. That's all he's saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I mean, it is in the 21st century, it is an indescribably absurd statement. Think of it. Well, let's identify who you are, check off a box. Okay, regardless of anything else, this group's going to be subject to worldwide taxation wherever you live, this group not.
You think?
I mean,
exactly.
This is crazy talk.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it could also be simpler to say, hey, people that are, in these however many states west of the Mississippi get this tax rate, and people who are, east of Mississippi get this tax rate. I mean, there's a lot of simpler ways of taxing people, okay, which are totally unfair. So it's not the only North Star. It can't be that the only North Star for a sensible tax system is just what's simplest, without respect to fairness or, like you said, circumstances of a person's life, or without respect to a person's ability to actually opt out, okay, right, by leaving the residency behind. I go even further, though. I don't even think he gets all the gains that he thinks he gets, okay, based off of citizenship, because in order to be in compliance, you have to know with certainty all the countries that you're possibly citizen of, assuming, unless he's taking the position that no, only the US can do this, and obviously no other country can have a similar policy. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm making a mistake, but I presume that he was talking about on a worldwide level, right? Like this would be workable system for many countries to have, not just the United States.
Without him specifically saying that, given that he's an American at an American university, I think it's hard to necessarily, or maybe it's overreaching to necessarily assume that he doesn't have a US-centric hegemony worldview, and that isn't probably arguing from a place that we haven't even really talked about, which is simply to perpetuate that hegemony as well. So I don't know if I'd reach that far.
Could be, yeah. You know, you might be right. We got Brent here. Brent, you wanna give us your thoughts here? Argue the devil's advocate. Inverted has been doing an admirable job at trying to put forth the best interpretation of Professor Zelinsky's paper here, but we'd love to hear. What are we missing here?
This is maybe going too far and gets a little conspiratorial, but like I would view this similar to like it's a similar question to like what would happen to the US if the Eurodollar system.
A devil's advocate, but I need about 5 to 10 minutes before I can do so. I'm at an airport checking in.
Sure. Go ahead, Inverted.
Sorry, all I was going to say is I think it's a similar question that like the real elephant in the room and why we don't make progress on this like we probably want to is because this is basically like saying like what would happen if the US gave up the petrodollar or the eurodollar, like if that system didn't exist. I mean, that's such a like these are the reasons we start wars. Like the number of people that we've killed over those sorts of things is innumerable. So we talk about these individual rights, but I really do think at a fundamental level, we're actually scratching at something that's way more powerful than actual even taxation. Yeah, I realize that's a little bit adjacent. We don't even have to go there, but I do think that is relevant.
That's a good point. Inverted. So I knew that I had read. So I read the 2011 paper a few months ago, and I forgot exactly where I read or why I thought that he thinks that this citizenship-based system can be worldwide, not just the United States. On page 1347, he has of the 2011 article. He has a section G. What about dual citizens? I'll just read this excerpt. In a world where citizenship-based taxation were to become widespread, what would happen to dual citizens? The same thing that happens today when an individual is a resident of more than one nation. The dual resident is either one, taxed by both nations in which he resides, or two, the two nations must agree as to which has primary jurisdiction to tax the dual resident. For example, the US model income tax treaty contains tie-breaking rules that determine which of the two signatory nations has primary jurisdiction to tax the income of an individual who resides in both nations. These tie-breaking rules could easily be applied and adapted to a world of citizenship-based taxation to determine which nation has primary jurisdiction to tax a person who is a citizen of more than one country. So I read this section to mean he is contemplating and thinks that his defense of U.S. citizenship-based taxation could spread to a worldwide level. Now, what are the hidden assumptions, right? Like that's where the devil is.
Well, the hidden assumption is that the tax treaties don't have the saving clause
Exactly.
that actually prevents U.S. citizens from using the tiebreaker.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
I mean, this is really not a very well thought through.
Like it's like he's arguing good faith, but it's like, okay, but as soon as the rubber meets the road, it's like, okay, but that's not what reality would be or is.
Well, his view presumably would be, and I think there is some evidence that he would be open to this in his paper, that the tax treaties, would somehow be amended to get rid of the saving clause or something like that, or to incorporate the residency tiebreaker in one of the exceptions to the saving clause, right? I mean, I guess he would say that, but I mean, again, all of this discussion is indicative of an astonishing lack of understanding of how this stuff actually works
and how it came to be, like why we are where we are.
John, in a world in which, go ahead, Inverted.
Even just like, let's say the most recent example regarding like global taxation would be at the corporate level at the global minimum tax. But like, come on, without the US signing on, this is dying on the operating table as we speak. So even in a world where, we all sing Kumbaya and everything's great and we redo all the tax treaties for no reason but to benefit the non-large nations in the world, which isn't going to happen, like, really? Do we really think it's not going to also come out in a world where the US, like the savings clause is going to continue to exist? I promise. So it's nice that he holds that view, but like, when can we get to the part of the paper that discusses reality?
Well, there is none. Okay, and there never will be, because in my humble opinion, it is impossible to actually understand what this is about and support it. It is so totally egregious. I mean, it reminds me very much of, what Ronald Reagan used to say, a communist is somebody who reads Marx, a non-communist is somebody who understands Marx, right?
That's good.
I mean, it is not possible until these people actually see what this is and how it actually operates. I mean, they are living in a world of theoretical fantasy.
Either that or they're not, they're they're not really being candid. But yeah, I would agree with you.
John, in a
Well,
world
sure.
of widespread citizenship-based taxation, what happens when an American turns 30, and it usually happens in their 30s, and they get more interested in their ancestry, and they realize that they have a claim to citizenship by descent in Hungary or Canada or what else. They contact a professional or they do their own research and they find out, oh, you know what? It's not actually naturalizing. I can apply for verification of citizenship. I was actually born a citizen. I just need to apply to be recognized as such. Well, what happens when we're in a world of citizenship-based taxation? In that instance, is the person?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah. So, I mean, let's hypothesize the following: that tomorrow everybody says, the U.S. has got the right idea. We are going to decrease citizenship taxation. Okay, let's imagine that. Well, under the existing tax treaty system without the saving clause, right? If, say, a French citizen moves to Canada, that French citizen will use the tax treaty tiebreak to be treated as a resident of Canada. Okay? So the point is, it's really the saving clause that makes it impossible for U.S. citizens. And by the way, I should say that today I think another article written by myself, Laura and Karen, came out on this particular issue, where we argue that one of the ways that President Trump could, in the double taxation of Americans abroad, is direct the Treasury Department to not exercise their rights under the saving clause, which will allow U.S. citizens abroad to use the treaty tiebreak, right? But the point is this: as it stands now, because only the U.S. has the saving clause, all right, the situation of U.S. citizens would not change, and the situation of non-U.S. citizens would not change either because of the way the treaty network works. Are you with me?
Yes, I'm with you. Yeah.
I mean, we have citizenship taxation. Now, in his paper, Professor Zelinsky quoted me as saying that citizenship taxation was immoral, and my impression is that that he didn't like that or found that to be inappropriate. Well, I would ask Professor Zelinsky if he thinks that it is moral to impose the U.S. tax code on people who don't live in the United States, are residents of other countries, uh, and with respect to income, that has no relationship to the United States. I mean, does he think that morality has nothing to do with it? Does he think it's moral?
Well, and he's going to respond from a collectivist view, and we're talking from an individualist, meaning that's the basis that he's attempting to define morality in this context, or vice versa.
Yeah, for people who haven't read the article, here's the section referencing John, page 106. Reflecting this attenuated notion of U.S. citizenship, Dr. Laura Snyder, Dr. Karen Alpert, and attorney John Richardson analogize U.S. taxation of its overseas residents to slavery and penal labor. Attorney Richardson.
By the way, I never did that. I do not think citizenship taxation is slavery.
Okay.
Never once have I said that, and I do not think that.
Okay. Attorney Richardson labels U.S. citizenship-based taxation as, quote, absolutely immoral, end quote. Overseas U.S. citizens, he tells us, are being held prisoner and captive to U.S. tax policies. That's
All
the
right,
line.
let's pause there. That I would have said. I'm sure I would have said. I don't remember it, but that I agree with and believe. Are U.S. citizens overseas held captive to U.S. tax policies? Yes or no?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
So what's his problem?
The basis the basis he's defining morality on.
He doesn't ever actually directly address you, John. He tees up this section by quoting you, and then he kind of moves on to Laura Snyder and kind of engages more with her statements and arguments.
Well, I actually would take the position that the proponents of citizenship taxation are taking a position that's immoral. That I will commit to. I mean, if they really understood it, right? I mean, I think it's immoral objectively. I think also they really don't understand what they're advocating. I mean, the thing about this latest Professor Zelinsky paper that's interesting is this is not a defense of citizenship taxation. This is an argument for citizenship taxation. Agreed?
Yes.
Yes.
And that makes it qualitatively different.
And different than what alternative?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of these types of things, right? A lot of people say, well, I think citizenship taxation is defensible, but I don't feel really strongly about it. I wouldn't necessarily advocate it. For example, his 2011 thing, I think, was a defense of citizenship taxation. I think. Okay. Meaning, well, domicile is historically a justifiable mechanism for tax residency. Citizenship is similar to domicile. So, I think it's defensible. This is qualitatively very, very different. Okay. This is an argument for citizenship taxation specifically by arguing that what U.S. citizenship means is taxation. That's a very, very different thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
By the way, for what it's worth, out of curiosity, I looked up how domicile is defined in the U.S. immigration law. And now, granted, obviously, we're talking about taxation here, right? And we can have words that have different meanings depending on the context, right? But I could only find two places in U.S. immigration law that domicile are defined, and the first one is in Section 213A1 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and this is in the context of sponsors, green card sponsors. Okay, so domicile here reads: domicile means the place where a sponsor has his or her principal residence, as defined in Section 101A 33 of the Act, with the intention to maintain that residence for the foreseeable future. So here, domicile basically means where the person has the residence, and also incorporates intention to maintain that residence in the definition. The second area in U.S. immigration law that domicile is referenced is in the Code of Federal Regulations again, but this time Section 316.5. Hold on 1 second. And it says, unless otherwise specified, for the purposes of this chapter, an alien's residence is the same as that alien's domicile or principal actual dwelling place, without regard to the alien's intent, and the duration of an alien's residence in a particular location is measured from the moment the alien first establishes residence in that location. That second context is residency of a legal permanent residence for the purpose of naturalization eligibility down the line. Now, what I see reading these two, okay, you have two definitions of a domicile, both within the context of U.S. immigration law, okay, and one explicitly incorporates the intention of the person, the other one explicitly excludes, basically, from consideration the intention of the of the person. But in both cases, domicile is tied to where the person has a residence or a dwelling place, which is ostensibly within the person's volition, tied to the circumstances of the person's life, right? In neither of these definitions of domicile is there any reference made to an immutable, or let's call it semi-immutable characteristic, because U.S. citizenship is not entirely immutable. You can renounce it, right? But it really takes upending. I mean, it takes literally ending of relationship entirely with the country on all levels to shed yourself
and family in the
and
country,
family of the country,
or at least that's consideration.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't, I've tried to look at the concept of citizenship as an administrable proxy for domicile in every way that I can, and I cannot see. They're so different. I mean, in one instance you can shed yourself of the domicile while still keeping your other ties to the country. The other you can't at all. I cannot see them as proxies, even for this limited purpose of citizenship-based taxation. Go ahead, Bernard.
By the way, the analogy in the tax code, the only one I'm aware of, perhaps there are more, would be the estate and gift tax regime, right? Defines residency in terms of domicile, interestingly, right? And I'm surprised he hasn't mentioned this, because if I were going to argue that citizenship is a proxy, for domicile, I mean, it's kind of like this, right? So for the U.S. estate and gift tax, citizens and non-citizen domiciliaries are subject, are treated a certain way, and non-citizen non-domiciliaries are treated another way, right? But I would try to equate citizenship and domicile, I think, by arguing through the estate and gift tax regime. But the point is that in the Treasury regulations, the way they define domicile is, I think it's living there with no intention to leave, right? Again, it's tied to circumstances of life. No matter how you look at this, upside down, sideways, and diagonally, Professor Zelinsky appears to be arguing for tax residency based primarily on circumstances of birth.
Even to go slightly more broad, I agree, John, slightly more broad with the concept of trying to get at the concept of domicile and its various contexts. I don't know this to be a fact, but I would guess that term probably was first used in a tax context in British common law. But even, the various territories that still exist and other countries, etc., Cyprus, Malta, Ireland, and obviously the UK as well, that still use domicile as a concept, like they would argue, and Brent could correct me on this, that sure, if you are a citizen of the UK and you are a resident of the UK, then by definition, you're in all likelihood going to be a tax resident. But being a citizen, even within, a much older historical context, never meant that, never automatically implied that you were a tax resident, or that necessarily your domicile was where you were a citizen of. So he can't even really argue on a historical basis.
Well, he's not. It's just a claim he's pulling out of thin air. He never tries to justify. You notice that? It's just a claim.
No, I understand. I'm just saying, like, if you were going to try, he couldn't even reach, meaning like he's using words that have historical meaning, but it completely ignoring, or seemingly completely ignoring, what it would have meant in those contexts, while arguing something that really means the opposite or close to it in many cases.
Yeah. Okay, look, all this comes down to all this gobbledygook, all this 155 pages in 2024 and the one in 2011 is, look, you know what? We just want to define tax residency in terms of circumstances of birth, because somehow it's administratively easy, and if you're a citizen, it means allegiance to the country or something like that. That's all this is, okay? And the rest of this is, I think, just a bit of a distraction, to keep people from focusing on what he's really saying.
Well, and he's defining easy as, hey, this is the status quo, therefore it is easy, because at least that's my understanding. Like, he's not at least doing a satisfactory job of saying, why is it? I'm saying it's easier. Here's why it is easier, at least to anyone like us on the ground that actually understands the situation.
Why does it matter what this guy thinks?
Because he's a law professor, and because he's part of a group of law professors who, are generally looked to as though they understand what they're talking about, and somehow, as sages on these types of issues. So if you get a group of law professors, who believe that citizenship taxation is reasonable, justifiable, it's going to be a lot harder to get rid of it. Conversely, it would be enormously helpful if this group of people would understand what this is and advocate to get rid of it. That's why this matters.
Do you think that they're open to changing their minds with input, or they're pretty fixed in their views?
I don't know. It's very, very difficult because, like all academics, well, I come from a family of academics, okay, so they live in sort of a rarefied air. And being an academic is the only place in the world you can say completely outrageous things without being called out, I
Oh,
think.
you're incentive. You're praised for saying outrageous things. Those are novel ideas, John.
Well, this is citizenship taxation is not a novel idea. All right, it's been around a long time. To either defend it without understanding what it is. I mean, if you go through the papers written by these people, starting with perhaps Professor Kirsch, and by the way, I'm going to say again, I've met a number of these people on a personal level. I like them, and respect their scholarship in general. Okay, but they are completely wrong on this, and and this is a problem. I don't know.
Well,
They people like systems, right? I mean, I do, you do, we all do. We like to have sort of a clean life, where things fit into nice boxes and categories, and we don't like to have to think about things, etc. And the phrase citizenship taxation, it sounds kind of compelling because it sounds good, but you don't have to understand what it is. Um, I don't know. Anybody think they're open to understanding this?
I hope they are. I think it's difficult to necessarily suggest that, though, when we seem to be, at least from the outset, and hopefully only from the outset, not seeing eye to eye, even on basic definitions of terms.
well, if the goal is to change their opinion, I wonder if there's a more established way for changing academics' opinion. From what I can tell, they seem to be largely swayed by social pressure. If they could get disinvited or booed from something, would that change their opinion?
We got to meet the person that's writing their grant checks. There we go. Problem solved.
I don't know. There's another citizenship taxation thing that came out recently. Professor Ruth Mason, who, in fairness, has not been overly sympathetic to citizenship taxation, but again, her work reflects no understanding of what it really means. But along with a Professor Dagan, or I don't know how to pronounce her, an Oxford professor, recently wrote something on citizenship taxation, which was not really an endorsement of it, but an understanding, I think, of why it might be appropriate in a increasingly mobile world. But what struck me about it again is they never talk about what it really means in the lives of the people who are subjected to it. They don't understand it.
John, in a world of widespread citizenship-based taxation, um, do you think a person could be in compliance without doing an inquiry, a robust inquiry of what countries they may be citizen of?
No, of course not.
This is Brent here. I
No,
think
of course not.
I don't have a ton of time here before I have to go, but I mean, I think your question is presupposing that you're going to have the right to keep more than one citizenship. And I think that's an assumption that we should not take for granted. I think that we're maybe very quickly moving to a world where you need to show your loyalty to one country and only one country. And there's a lot of people who think that's the right way the world should work. You can bowl on that. I would only say this. I think that citizenship taxation is somewhat of an anachronism of how things were created. And the problem is to change it makes it, for anyone to really advocate changing it, means that we have to sort of exempt a certain class of people from what many people view as sort of an obligation of the society, which is paying taxes. So here's my devil's advocate argument for you, which is to say, if societies can define what the costs and the burdens are of being a member and who can be a member, and the act of filing your tax, if you will, just the mere act of doing it, is part of your allegiance to that society. And so the Americans I've argued with who've argued the other side, who think we should keep citizenship-based tax, say, look, it's a fundamental piece of being an American that you show your loyalty by paying tax. And so I think that may not encompass everyone who thinks that wants to keep citizenship-based tax, but it's quite another thing to then move to residency, where you are affirmatively exempting a group of citizens from that obligation. And I think a lot of people have a problem with that. So again, I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting I believe that. I'm just arguing. I'm trying to play the devil's
No,
advocate
I
here.
understand. Well, I mean, I thought about that, particularly in relation to the Zelinsky paper. It's one thing to say that taxation is an obligation of citizenship. Why don't we accept that? But that doesn't mean that taxation, in the same way as residence, should be an obligation of citizenship. I think many Americans abroad would be far better off, if they were just, in other words, what about an Eritrea model? Okay. I'm not advocating this, but I think this would be better for a lot of people is, all right, you're an American citizen, you live outside the United States according to some kind of set of rules. Basically, we're going to require taxation, and the way we do it is we total up your gross income according to these principles of what income is. You write us a check for 5% of that. Now, if that were the case, I think that would actually, nobody, there'd be plenty of people who wouldn't like it, but that would be a lot more reasonable than what's going on today. Right now, people can't comply with an obligation that's imposed on them. They can't comply.
So, John, I
Too
think
complicated, too costly.
So are those people wanting to come back to the United States ever? Why don't they just give up their citizenship? This is the arguments I get in. So I'm just going to play the other side here. So I'll be the other side. Just give it up then.
Because to give up their
why do you want to keep it?
Because of family connections, usually, to the United States. Usually because of family connections. These are the people who are reluctant, to give up their citizenship. I think one could very reasonably view citizenship taxation, right, as sort of, to give up citizenship is to create a Berlin Wall. Right? As what is the JFK said, separating family members who wish to be together, or even visit, sort of thing.
But
they don't understand what giving up citizenship means. It means no longer being able to access or having a right of access to family members. That's usually the issue. That's why people don't give it up.
So you can still visit, though. Is that not good enough, John?
No,
Maybe.
that's not necessarily the case at all. That is, you become an alien and you're subject to the immigration laws, whatever they may be. Maybe you can visit today, maybe not tomorrow.
Okay, so by definition, you're admitting that citizenship has a value. So why aren't you willing to pay for it?
Yes, I think citizenship has a value. Of course, I think all citizenships have value. But that's a different thing from, therefore, the U.S. rules of citizenship taxation should exist. They're worlds apart. I'll repeat. Let's say that you buy into the idea that, fundamentally what U.S. citizenship is about. Every July 4th, we can have a celebration of taxation, okay? The 4th of July. Today we come together to celebrate what U.S. citizenship means, taxation. Fine. That doesn't mean that U.S. citizens abroad should be subjected to the kind of income tax system that they can't comply with. Tax them in another way. Tax them the way Eritrea taxes its citizens abroad. How much you make, pay us a percentage, that's it.
By the way, I agree with that piece because, look, I have a hard time arguing out of this one, which is, so if you argue it's an accident of birth, and you also are saying that citizenship has value because you, as a U.S. citizen, can enter the U.S., you have a right to, as you just said, and I agree with that, then the question, of course, becomes, But isn't it true that you versus anyone else living in Canada, the fact that you have this special status is just your accident of birth? And so is that fair, right? I mean, how is it any more fair that Americans abroad who are U.S. citizens have different rights than other members of people living in that society, other Canadians, other French people? And it's only
Right, but this
because,
is
of your accident of birth, right? So shouldn't you have to pay
What
for
is an
that, right?
accident of birth? I don't even understand what you're saying. What is an accident of birth,
The fact that you're a U.S. citizen to begin with.
right? Therefore,
Therefore, you have a privilege that other people don't have.
right. But if
So
we are
shouldn't you
getting
have
to
to
the
pay
point in
for
the
that?
conversation
This
where
is
we
the
can
argument on the other
where
side. This is the argument on the other side.
we're getting to the point where we can see that there is value. So then really the whole discussion becomes, what should the cost of that value be?
Exactly. That would be the argument. And I agree with John's, by the way. I got to go probably here, but I agree that an Eritrea-like model is more appropriate than trying to fit the U.S. domestic model to people who are living abroad. But I do wonder if we would not be better in our plight trying to argue that it's an issue of fitting a round peg into a square hole versus it is a pure you shouldn't have to pay for anything type model, right? In other words, I think we might have more success arguing for moving to a more like user fee type basis. I mean, that's tricky with fear that wealthy people are going to only have to then pay 500 a year or whatever. But something that the root of our problem with the system is the fact that the rules don't mesh, don't work well together.
John,
That's really the core of the problem.
John,
Or as you said earlier, that the treaty doesn't allow us this the savings clause.
John, how about these two arguments? You suggest, which I think is a reasonable suggestion, that the system is not functioning. You would agree with that, the way it currently is?
yeah, sure, of course, I'd agree with it.
Okay. What about from the standpoint of view, again, if we're looking at it from the government, I think they might argue it is functioning. Even though you're getting non-compliance and all the stuff that it hurts, blah, blah, blah. When has the US government not been willing to hurt people, including its own citizens? The goal of the system is to deter tax evasion. That's the primary goal, or at least I'm asserting that at this moment. That is the primary goal. And through the lens of that, it is arguably working, or at least it's working better than it has in the past.
What evidence do you have for that?
Well, by adding guilt.
If anything, for Americans abroad, they've made it impossible for them to comply.
I'm talking about the size. I'm talking about big tax dollars, like the real tax dollars, the people that they don't want to let out of the net. I think it's unarguably true. I don't know if Brent is still here, but I'm sure he would agree that it is dramatically harder for a wealthy person to go offshore to even get unlimited deferral, let alone actually avoid tax, than 10 years ago, certainly versus 30 years ago, 50 years ago. So from that standpoint, they're
No.
succeeding.
All you do is you move to residence-based taxation. They sever tax residency to get hit with an exit tax.
Right, but I'm saying for someone that wants to remain an American citizen, it is really not an option the way it was 10 years ago and certainly 30 or 50 years ago to move offshore and either get unlimited deferral or actually avoid tax. So in that context, they are succeeding with their goal.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And beyond that,
I mean, you're assuming there's a they there. I mean, I don't think there's a they there in the sense that I don't think there's a collective that there's somebody on the other side really thinking through.
You
I
don't
think
think
that the
that?
IRS
You,
just sort of applies the law. No, I don't. I think that there's political inability. I think there's not a good enough political argument to change the status quo, but I'm not
so you don't
entirely
think that
sure
there's
that I think that
anyone
there's some
conscious?
cabal.
You don't think that there's anyone in a position of power that consciously thinks if we allow those floodgates to open, that actually potentially threatens the power, the funding power, and the ability to raise debt that the United States has? No one is in there thinking that?
I personally, I don't think that they're thinking that way. No, I don't think that they've even gone that far because I don't know if they think people would. Where are you going to go? I think fundamentally, I still think most people in the U.S. have American exceptionalism blinders on. And I don't think that they think that there's that many people that are leaving. I don't think they're trying to build a Hotel California here. I think if we came up with a great winning political argument for moving to residency-based tax, that Congress would do it. But right now, it doesn't seem like there's a good political argument, and the arguments seem better the other way. But I don't think there's some mastermind in DC sitting there saying, "Aha, we can't let these people go." But maybe I'm naive.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not. That's always the argument they make for PR, right? We're allowing people out. So, like, I would be worried about that if I was the Treasury Secretary and we all of a sudden switched to a true residence base where, not saying you would game it, but like really you could leave.
We'd probably have an
I
exit
would be
tax,
worried
though.
about
I
that.
mean, I would imagine.
Yeah, but
Yeah, I would
again,
imagine there would be an
why
exit.
other countries manage this through their departure taxes?
Yeah, but no one is as rich as we are.
What?
You don't think that's fair to say that no country is as rich as the United States is? On average, like the average seriously wealthy person?
You mean on the average? I don't know. But I mean, what difference does it make? Regardless of the level of wealth, you can collect your pound of flesh under residency-based taxation with a departure tax.
Well, I'm just making the argument that it is a check, meaning the fact that citizenship-based taxation exists allows Congress to squeeze us as hard as they want. That is a fact. Where if it didn't exist, that stops their ability to raise revenue, at least at the extremes. Like, look at what France is doing right now. France has hit the limit. And I'm sure they would love to have some barriers at the door because it would probably allow them to push a little bit harder. That's all I'm saying.
I think all roads lead to renunciation. That's what I think.
Brent,
I mean, I agree. It's very difficult to get change. Okay. But papers like this thing from Professor Zelinsky undoubtedly make it harder.
Brent, I don't know if you read Professor Zelinsky's 2024 paper, but one of the things that you said your clients or the people you discuss with, say, which is, paying U.S. taxes, filing the income tax each year is kind of an act of loyalty or an act of basically supporting the polity or whatever. Professor Zelinsky makes exactly that argument. I thought you had the article in front of you when you were saying that. He makes exactly that argument in favor of citizenship-based taxation, especially in the situations in which it doesn't actually result in a tax bill. Just the act of going through the filing procedure is an act of loyalty, of support, of being ready to support and to be called on to support the United States when necessary. One thing, Brent, that you meant. Go ahead, Brent.
No, I was just saying yes. That's why I was trying to say that argument is that like these are not arguments I believe in, but I think this is what you get on the other side. I mean, listen, certainly it doesn't mind me if I need any forgetting that I am a U.S. citizen in the sense that I have to meet the filing obligations every year, and I suppose it makes me think of the country.
Right, and then one other thing that you mentioned, you mentioned you think we might be headed towards a world where you're not allowed to have multiple citizenship. You're basically considered to be a citizen of one country, and that's it. And I don't think that's the case, but it's possible, right? But here's the thing: even if that's the case, it still doesn't eliminate all of the fact-intensive inquiry necessary to find out where you're a citizen of, right? Because we don't have one supranational body that determines, okay, this person is a citizen of this country, and that's it, and no other countries. We have 190 plus countries applying their own domestic law, right? And then we have, vis-a-vis who they consider to be a citizen of their country and who's not. And then we have those same 190 plus countries applying their domestic law to determine who they recognize as a foreign citizen or not, right? So so as a practical matter, yes, as a legal matter, a country can say we prohibit dual citizenship. As a practical matter, right? Two different countries that both say they prohibit dual citizenship can very much claim by operation of law one person as a citizen of both of those countries. And in fact, that does happen. So my point is that Professor Zelinsky's thought about efficiency gains that can be obtained by moving from a fact-intensive inquiry vis-a-vis domicile to just citizenship. I don't think they exist the way he thinks that they exist. I think he thinks they exist because he doesn't understand how acquisition of citizenship works and how much disharmony there is among countries in the world, with regards to recognition of citizenship. So even in the country, even in a hypothetical, future where, let's say, United States, European countries, a bunch of big countries prohibit dual citizenship, unless we move away from citizen mostly being a creature of domestic national law, meaning one country determines who's a citizen of their country and who's not. Unless we move away from that, I don't see any reduction in the complexity of that inquiry.
Well, I think it could be done totally differently. I mean, I think it'd be done when you go to renew your U.S. passport, you have to swear under penalties of perjury you're not a citizen of any other country, and if you lie, they throw you in jail, right? I mean, I think that would root it out pretty quickly.
That assumes that you know definitively what country you are or might be a citizen of, and tens of millions just in the United States. In my opinion, tens of millions do not. They are citizens. They were born citizens of foreign country by operation of law, and they're not aware of it. Happens all the time. I have clients all the time for citizenship by descent. We're not applying for naturalization for them. We're applying for verification.
I know you're right. I'm just saying that I could see the politics coming to a point where you have a loyalty test, so to speak.
Yeah. Right.
And there's a view that you should only be a U.S. If you want to be a U.S. citizen, you need to only be a U.S. citizen. And I could see things spiral to that very quickly.
Could be.
Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
You can change the words to the best of your knowledge. Are you only a citizen of the United States under penalty of whatever?
Absolutely right. And that could make them be in compliance with that form, but that has no authority on a foreign country to claim the person. That has no effect on whether a person by operation of law of a foreign country is a citizen or not. So it's not.
Well, yeah, true. But I think the concept I'm trying to go at is that U.S. doesn't care about that. The concept would be we're going to enforce citizenship taxation, and you don't like it. Well, John, you either decide to stay in Canada or you get back here and you stay a U.S. citizen type idea, right? I mean, it could go that way.
Yeah, I see. I agree.
That's all I'm trying to say.
I agree. That's only workable in my opinion, in a system in which we have one country that's the hegemon, like the United States, and other countries are not trying to. Right? Remember, the whole question came up initially in the context of what happens if the world moves to a citizenship-based taxation system, right? If you have a wealthy person, if you have an Elon Musk, okay, for example.
Oh well.
What's that? If you have an Elon Musk, okay, let's say.
I was just going to say, in a world of I don't think the U.S. would care. Do you think the U.S. would give you a foreign tax credit for amounts that you paid under citizenship-based taxation under a different country? I don't think they would.
No, I don't think they would either, right? Which is why I'm trying to say that the idea of a worldwide citizenship-based taxation is untenable. Professor Zelinsky, from his paper, 2011 paper, writes that he thinks it's tenable and how it would work. I don't think it's tenable. I think the most powerful countries, like the United States, would claim the wealthy citizens as their own citizens and show a big middle finger to any other country trying to claim them, or a person, like you said, trying to present a foreign tax credit. My point is, I'm not saying I don't think the United States can do this. I think they can. My point is, it's not the citizenship-based taxation model, the worldwide level. It's not as tenable as Professor Zelinsky thinks it is, in my opinion. And the thing is, I mean, if the most you can do, in my opinion, practically, is you can make a form that says, like Inverted said, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not, right? Has no legal effect on foreign countries. And you could also prevent people from, let's say, taking, observing a benefit from their foreign citizenship, right? You could say, hey, you cannot use you cannot do any of these things. You cannot realize any of these benefits of foreign citizenship. But you can't tell the person that they cannot be a citizen of another country. That's a decision, made by foreign domestic law of a different country. So yeah, my point was just in the context of the expansion of the citizenship-based taxation system on a worldwide level. This thing only works, in my opinion, when it's a few, powerful countries doing it and pulling the rest of the world.
I mean, the good news is, pragmatically speaking, there's only like one country in the world that even controls the pipes, so to speak, well enough to attempt it. So that part of the paper is extremely theoretical, even relative to the rest of the theoretical stuff.
Agreed. I mean, that goes to enforceability, right? Okay, so we've been going for about 2 hours now. It's been a good, robust discussion. Do we want to bring it home here, or does anybody have anything that they want to touch on before we end? All right. Well, looks like we've had a nice, robust conversation here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thanks, John, for co-hosting, and Veri, Brent, David, all of our listeners and our anonymous listeners. This has been our 36th mobility space on the hottest topics in dual citizenship and freedom of movement, sovereignty, and passports, of course. We will have our next mobility space on Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'm going to put up a poll today with 4 potential topics. Feel free to vote in that poll. Let us know which topic you want to talk about, and we will let the interwebs decide what the next topic is. So that's it. Thank you, everybody, and have a great week. Thanks for all your contributions.